But in the meantime, please join with me in welcoming Ian to the stage.
Good morning, colleagues. Like the Minister, like Veena, I would like to start by acknowledging that we're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations people who might be with us today. I'll start by apologising on behalf of our Secretary, Jim Betts, who would have very much enjoyed being at the conference today. Jim is unwell. Jim has been a great supporter of ecologiQ and of the program of work, and a great believer in the work that we're going to do to transform infrastructure from a whole range of perspectives, but particularly for this conference from the perspectives of circular economy and of decarbonisation or net zero. Thanks also to Minister Stitt for laying out, and to the Victorian Government for laying out such a compelling vision. And I would note that this is a once-in-a-generation challenge that we face. It's possibly a once-in-several generations challenge that we face, and I'll speak a bit about that. Structurally, what I'll talk to you about today, I'll give you some context and numbers because I love context and numbers. I wouldn't be a strategic advisor if I didn't. I'll speak a bit about the Australian Government's work on circular economy on behalf of some of my colleagues in the Environment Department, and then I'll talk about the parallel and linked agenda of decarbonisation of infrastructure, which I have a substantial role to play in, or my team does. I guess I wanted to leave you, though, for a conference like this with a key thought, and that is to help you with the work you're doing by reminding you that the Australian Government and our state and territory colleagues are committed to greener infrastructure. There is no doubt about that. We are working in the fields of circular economy and decarbonisation. We are setting targets, and we are developing and deploying programs across all range of activities, and I'll talk about a lot of those today. So if you do reflect on anything from this talk, and I won't be as exciting as ministers will, and I won't be as exciting as practitioners will, but do just go away and think we are here. The Australian Government is here, and we are focusing on this sector. Okay. Normally with a smaller group, I'd say, is that okay? You're comfy with that agenda? But I'm not going to do that here. Let me give you some broad context, firstly around waste. In 2020-21, Australia generated an extraordinary 75.8 megatons of waste. About 60% of that, or 42 megatons, was recycled, but there are quite low rates of recycling in areas such as plastics, 12.7%, organics, 58%, which is better than it was when I last worked in the field, and textiles at about 6%. Despite significant investment in recycling infrastructure, there is still a shortfall in capacity. The Australian Government does have a recycling modernisation fund that many of you, I suspect, are aware of, which is intended to leverage over $1 billion in new investment, $1 billion in new investment for recycling infrastructure, and is already, I believe, processing well over 1 million tonnes per annum. But we will need more advanced technologies to sort, disassemble, process, recycle and remanufacture waste at higher rates, and to address problematic waste streams such as plastics, organics, textiles and particularly e-waste. Moving to infrastructure for a moment. Understanding the current operating environment for infrastructure is crucial to how we think about the circular economy, as well as our approach to net zero or decarbonisation. There is an unprecedented demand for new infrastructure in Australia. Some stats, our combined 5-year pipeline of major infrastructure projects, 2021-22 to 2025-26, is $237 billion. That's $15 billion higher than the equivalent 5-year pipeline was a year ago. The highest proportion of this spend is on transport infrastructure. New South Wales has the highest expected spend, followed by Victoria. we're making record investments in road infrastructure, which is an interesting conversation in itself. 998 road projects will be delivered between 2015 and 2031, demanding about 200 million tonnes of conventional materials. An extraordinary set of numbers these are. With this ballooning demand for materials, there's a ballooning waste problem. As I mentioned before, 76 million tonnes of waste generated in just 1 year. That's from the National Waste Report. That's about 2.95 tonnes per person. That's what we're grappling with. Moving to climate change. I didn't write this when I was noting this, but I always like to talk about this because it just reminds me of the challenge we face. August, just completed, was the second hottest month in terms of worldwide global average temperatures ever recorded. The hottest month was July. It's stark figures that we're grappling with. Since 2005, greenhouse gas emissions from the transport sector, to pick one example, an important one for us, have increased by 11%. Transport's now about 19% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions and is on track to be the largest contributor to our emissions by 2030. Although I must say, having worked on energy for much of my career, there's a little glimmer of something very positive in that the reason transport will become the largest emitter is that the energy sector, its decarbonisation trajectory is so strong. The increase in renewable energy is, I just wouldn't have believed it 20 years ago, which says something about innovation, says something about technology, it says something about the sort of energy conversations that people like yourselves have been having in rooms now for several decades. And it's very exciting from that point of view. So I like to start with the Grim Reaper kind of comments, but there is a very positive story to tell. One of my staff suggested I use this, and I said, no, I won't, but I think this looks like a group I would. One of our leading climate scientists, who I was talking to in Canberra not long ago, I asked, frankly, given where we are sitting in terms of the latest IPCC report, how are we looking? And he said, well, Ian, we are up the creek, but we still have a paddle. And I think that's positive, so I'm happy to work with that. Achieving the economy-wide targets that the Australian government has set and that state and territory governments have set will take substantial efforts to drive emissions down across every sector, and infrastructure will be a big part of that, transport infrastructure in particular. It contributes approximately 12% of transport emissions overall, so about 3% of Australia's total emissions. Interestingly, I picked these figures up from the GI Hub. If we look at emissions associated with infrastructure, so sometimes we use the term Scope 3 emissions, sometimes we use the term enabled emissions, that's quite popular in some sectors. If you look across all forms of infrastructure, energy, transport, water, waste, digital comms and building, infrastructure influences 79% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. So the decisions we make about infrastructure, not just how, but what we build, are a huge part of our climate change response and the story that comes from that. Interestingly, also from the GI Hub, globally, infrastructure accounts for more than half of the world's projected materials use annually. And G20 countries are responsible for around 70% of this consumption. So, we have a challenge in terms of infrastructure, and we have two challenges in terms of waste and climate. For transport infrastructure, the emissions that we see, the emissions sources, are substantially from input materials. So our response on climate change and our response on circular economy and materials use are inextricably linked. The input materials we choose, cement, concrete, aluminium, steel, etc., release greenhouse gas emissions. You all know that, I won't talk you through that. The emissions reduction pathways that we see are around the use of low carbon input materials, as well as those big circular economy choices around what to build, what not to build, and how to recover materials at end of life. Green steel, cement, aluminium, low carbon recycled materials. And like the Minister, I was astounded to take a walk out in the hall before the session today and just see the plethora of new ideas that were out there. Just extraordinary. So congratulations to all of you. So, Australian Government action on circular economy. I shall look at my little timer. It says 14. I'm not sure I'm going to leave a lot of time for questions, Veena, sorry. And that's not deliberate. You can come and grab me in the break. All of this points to the urgency and the need for policy interventions by government. The Australian Government, along with our state and territory colleagues, as the Minister laid out, are committed to provide the policy settings to develop and make real a circular economy, the policy settings that you need to innovate and to have the conversations with each other that you're having. The work I'll speak about now is not work from my department, it is work from Minister Plibersek and her department in the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. I will refer to them henceforth as DQ. My department is Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communications and the Arts, and there is a challenge. If anyone can come up with a really good spoken acronym for us, please see me in the break. As I say, I hope I can do my colleagues' work justice. CSIRO estimates that Australia's economy is sitting at about 8 or 9% circular. Please do not ask me how they calculated that. Doubling this in line with some of our international, in line with international best practice, will require wide-reaching systems change, which is very important. The government is looking to set the direction, providing system-wide transitional support and taking action in the short term on problematic products. Specifically, this involves developing a national circular economy framework that's informed by the work of the Circular Economy Ministerial Advisory Group, which reports to Minister Plibersek, chaired by Professor John Thwaites, who I suspect would be familiar to many of the people in this room, which will look at the role of circular economy in the built environment. And our department has been working with DQ very closely on that. We're negotiating a new global plastics treaty, updating sectoral plans to provide appropriate industry focus, so the National Waste Policy Action Plan, a new chemicals industry transition plan. We're strengthening national standards for the management of industrial chemicals, working with states and territories to harmonise waste collection systems, such as container deposit schemes and phase-outs and bans of problematic single-use plastics. And it's great to see Victoria's container deposit scheme up and running. That's very exciting. We're also supporting product stewardship schemes. These have a long history and they still play, I think, a big part because they allow and support innovation. I won't go through the specific targets in the National Waste Action Plan because that would just fill dead air, but they are important and they are worth noting. And one thing I would say is that the National Waste Action Plan is a 2019 document and is being revisited now. So that gives some consistency of policy for people, which I think is very, very important. At the end of the day, though, and looking at you and looking at the hall where I went earlier, there won't be a sustainable recycling sector, there won't be a circular economy without pull-through from markets. And that's where the work that ecologiQ has done, has come from ecologiQ, has been so important. I was saying to Alexis earlier, I don't think I fully understood prior to ecologiQ emerging how much you would get from such a strong pull in the marketplace. So I think it's terrific. In order to collect, there needs to be capacity to process. In order to process, there needs to be market demand for recycled materials. The Australian Government is supporting growth in our recycling industry in particular by funding or offsetting investment risk in new processing infrastructure, establishing a new traceability framework for recycled to build confidence in its use and quality, and that's such an important role for government. One of the areas we're doing a lot of work in the climate change space is hydrogen, of course. Now, hydrogen is probably a bit less in the front of mind than it was a decade ago, but one of the really important things is having a guarantee of origin and having a way of tracking where the hydrogen you buy has come from so you know what the environmental credentials of it are. And that's very true of any environmentally sustainable or greener material, depending on the language you like to use. We're developing a Remade in Australia brand for products that are locally made and regulating to require the use of recycled content in packaging placed on the market. Specifically in the infrastructure sector, and this is work that Infrastructure Australia have done, my good friend and colleague Adam Kopp, I checked, is probably almost in the room. He's not quite. He is here he'll be here for a session shortly, the CEO of IA. But Infrastructure Australia with DQ and project advisors, ecologiQ, launched the replacement materials report late last year. The road infrastructure sector often uses recycled materials, as we know, to reduce waste and emissions. Due to increased public investment, there's a growing demand, and this report estimated that up to 27% of conventional materials, around 54 million tonnes, can be replaced with recycled materials. There are people who know these numbers better than I in the room, but they're great numbers. With concerted efforts to overcome obstacles, this rate could go up to 59%, or about 119 million tonnes of conventional materials. We need to make sure, 8 minutes 36 seconds, that's good, we need to make sure that government procurement also matches this policy setting. I was going to say rhetoric, we don't do rhetoric, policy setting from government. DQ is currently developing an environmentally sustainable procurement policy which will be applied APS-wide. There's a lot of other new developments going on in procurement. IA's Market Capacity Report in 2022 forecast the opportunity to address supply-side challenges with recycled materials, so we're providing information and data. The Infrastructure Sustainability Council is piloting a new credit on recycled content in rated infrastructure projects. The Australian Roads Research Board has recently put out a technical report on the application and use of 10 recycled materials in road and rail infrastructure and looked at the environmental, social and economic impacts of use of these. And Austroads has recently put out national standards for the use of recycled plastic, glass and rubber in roads. There's a lot going on. The purchasing side of things, as well as the strategic investment side, is really important. But just to finish on circular economy, it does require, and the circular economy and our development of it does require policy leadership, certainty, regulatory settings, the things governments do and do well and sometimes slowly. But it also needs appropriate measurement of waste and a supply of alternative materials. But it also needs culture change and behaviour change. We need to think of the circular economy not as an externally exposed requirement, but as business as usual for the industries we're all part of. And that's why I find conferences like this one just so inspiring. These considerations need to happen at every stage in the value chain. I had a meeting recently where the industry participants I was meeting with made the great point that both decarbonisation and the circular economy are white-collar solutions with blue-collar implementation. What a lovely term. And it's true, which means we need innovation from the shop floor up. So I think that points to me to a behaviour change question as much as to a regulatory settings question. Okay, 6 minutes on the home straight. Everyone okay? Good. Let's move to what keeps me awake at night, decarbonisation of infrastructure. In the 2023-24 federal government budget, the government announced $8 million to develop a comprehensive net zero transport and infrastructure roadmap and action plan that will cover all modes of transport, alternative fuels, new technology, and the infrastructure needed to support the transition of the sector to net zero. That is work that our Department of Infrastructure, I will call this in shorthand, are leading. It will be one of the 6 sectoral plans that Minister Bowen announced some weeks ago, which will chart Australia's course towards net zero by 2050, 43% reduction against 2005 emissions by 2030, and our as yet unfinalised 2035 target, which will also be part of our United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change commitments. The Australian Government will work with all levels of government, industry and the community in developing this, or all of these plans, but in particular our infrastructure and transport plan. And we want to make the most of the opportunities provided by public and private investment, which means conversations like the ones you're having here are crucial. Further to the Commonwealth's commitments, ministers from all states and territories agreed in June that all jurisdictions would work together to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in transport and transport infrastructure. And can I just say, this is crucial. I mean, yes, the Commonwealth will provide very strong leadership in this space, and we will continue to. We have targets for greenhouse gas emissions reduction. We are committed, they are now legislated targets. We will need to develop policies and programs which take us there. We have many in play already. Some of my colleagues are working night and day, it's extraordinary, on the fuel efficiency standards program for motor vehicles, which many of you may have heard about. But we'll need more, and that's what we're working on. But when the Commonwealth and states and territories come together, that's when real change happens. And that's why I think this decision in June from the Commonwealth ministers, Commonwealth, State and Territory Ministers for Infrastructure is so important. What ministers agreed was that we would develop nationally consistent approaches to valuing and measuring the embodied carbon in transport infrastructure. There have been many approaches to valuing carbon for decision-making purposes, and there's lots of different values out in the marketplace. We're keen to make sure that there's one set of values that everyone can use, so you can cross state borders and you're using the same numbers. Secondly, approaches to measurement. We're working with our colleagues in, that work, by the way, is being led by Infrastructure Australia. Welcome, Adam, you got here. New South Wales, Infrastructure New South Wales are leading the work around measurement of emissions, and they're very keen to make sure, and they're absolutely right in this, that what we do is look at the inputs and outputs from any way of measuring the emissions associated with infrastructure, so that there's still room for innovation in the tools that people use to do that measurement. There's lots already in the marketplace, we wouldn't want to get rid of them. So we want to standardise and make sure that we've got an agreed approach to how we measure the carbon embodied in and associated with transport infrastructure. The third piece of work that we're doing for ministers for later this year is to talk to them about and give them some advice on the best policy levers they've got individually and collectively, 2 minutes, 21 seconds to go, to address and reduce those emissions. So let's measure it, let's value it, and then let's make sure that we know whether the best approach is to use cost-benefit analyses or whatever it may be. Two of the key levers, just quickly, that we obviously have in play, and some of you may be familiar with these, and are the Infrastructure Policy Statement and the National Partnership Agreement. Now, the Infrastructure Policy Statement, federally, will set the strategic direction for our infrastructure investment. Obviously, not just around environmental matters, not just around circular economy and emissions, but across all aspects of infrastructure. It'll support the infrastructure pipeline to be targeted towards sustainable, nationally significant and productivity-enhancing projects. That is underway. The other one we have underway is the National Partnership Agreement on Land Transport Infrastructure Projects. I love that, what a mouthful, 2019 to 2024, the NPA. It's important because it governs the way in which Commonwealth funding provided for land transport infrastructure projects administered under the National Land Transport Act are carried out by states and territories. It's our agreement with states and territories for how infrastructure will be built. That is now being obviously with a 2014 expiry date, that's now being reworked, and there's a large group of Commonwealth and state officials working away on providing advice to government for what will become a new Federation funding agreement schedule, which will set the Australian government's expectations around infrastructure. And I guess the key thing I wanted to leave you with is a big part of that conversation has been around decarbonisation and circular economy. And it's been terrific because Victoria have been able to share their best practice in that process and showcasing the ecologiQ initiative to other jurisdictions through that work. So that is underway now. Excellent. Pauses for breath with 20 seconds to go. So colleagues, in summary, we have a huge challenge, a substantial infrastructure build, in particular in the transport sector, coupled with the need for greater circularity in the materials sector and a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The Commonwealth Government has set and continues to set ambitious targets for greenhouse gas emissions reduction and for waste and recycling, as have our colleagues in the states and territories. We are developing and implementing policies and programs to achieve those targets. But at the end of the day, what we need is innovation, commitment, and a culture of decarbonisation and a circular economy. And much of this comes from you and from programs such as ecologiQ. Thank you very much.
You don't have time for any questions.